Right, well, coming up after 7, we're going to turn our attention to Syria. It's the conflict that seems to be never ending, frankly. Well, the French President François Hollande has called for the EU arms embargo on Syria to be lifted in order to aid anti-government forces. He says we're ready to support the rebels, so we're ready to go that far. That is a dramatic development in this conflict. Will the British government follow suit? William Hague has been hinting in that direction over...
Ian Dale at Drive.
5 minutes past 7 here on LBC 97.3. It's been an incredibly busy show so far. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and particularly if you phoned in. Hundreds of you have phoned in. Apologies to all of you whose calls we couldn't get to over the last 3 hours, but we have an hour to go. And we're going to be talking about Syria because it's become, I think, one of the big political stories in the news agenda.
Ian Dale at Drive.
Now, France and Britain are ready to arm rebels in Syria, even without full support from the European Union, French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said today. UK government sources said that no decision has been taken to seek the lifting of the EU arms embargo on Syria, but they stressed that all options remain on the table. Well, French President François Hollande is not so reticent. This is what he said today at the EU summit in Brussels. We are ready to support the rebels, so we're ready to go that far. He told reporters that France and the UK agreed on the issue, but other countries would have to be convinced. Now, Russia, which is obviously not in the EU and is one of Syria's principal allies, has absolutely opposed any arming of Syria's opposition. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this pans out at this EU summit, because President Hollande and David Cameron say they're going to try and raise the issue with other EU leaders on Friday, but it's very difficult to see countries like Germany, Sweden, actually agreeing to lift an arms embargo. But is it fair that the Syrian government can actually get arms from all sorts of sources, particularly from Russia, and yet the rebels can't? 0845 6060 973. What do you think it would mean for the conflict if France and Britain did agree to supply arms to the rebels? Should we steer well clear, or do you think we have a moral responsibility to arm the rebels? Because, of course, there's a great humanitarian tragedy developing in Syria. Lots of refugees trying to make their way to Turkey, to the Lebanon, to Jordan. Lots of 2 million children are apparently now in dire poverty in Syria. Does the international community not have a responsibility to intervene? 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. Well, with me in the studio is Charles Shoebridge, former Army officer, security analyst, and former counter-terrorism intelligence officer. Now, Charles, what do you make of these latest developments?
I think, first of all, the question that you've raised is obviously a very important one. The idea that Britain should arm rebels that are currently in Syria, I think, would be a very big mistake indeed, on every ground that you can possibly imagine. For example, in the realms of humanitarian issues, first of all, you've got an area which is Syria, completely awash with weapons at the moment. Many analysts have said that the Syrian rebels themselves now, increasingly because they've been supplied weapons. They are being supplied weapons, let's not forget, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. Weapons are also coming in, it is believed, covertly from the Western Allies via the former Yugoslavia and so on. There have been many reports about this, but certainly they are being well armed from those Gulf states for their own agenda, which we can come on to later on. But in terms of... And also, of course, they're capturing weapons from the other side. The reason why there's a humanitarian disaster isn't because the people are being attacked by Assad, no matter how despicable he may be in many ways. The reason why there is a humanitarian disaster is because there is a war. There is a war because two sides are fighting each other. For us to arm one side, to pump weapons into an area already awash with weapons, will do nothing for the civilian population of that country. There is a military stalemate there at the moment. The route to peace and to stability and a return to normal life for these Syrian civilians, as you say, so many of them have had to flee their homes, is surely the Russian solution. We can disagree with the Russians in many, many ways, in many aspects of their foreign and especially their domestic policy. But surely, in an area like Syria, so important strategically as well for Western interests, a negotiated peace settlement that actually brings into place a ceasefire and then possibly a lasting peace is what Britain should be aiming for. And frankly, at the moment, it is not. It is militarising, it is fighting for one side, and a side in this conflict which, frankly, is not our side.
What? Right. Well, why is that? Why is the British government taking this stance?
Well, a lot of people, of course, were mystified by this. Britain says that this is about, or Britain doesn't actually say, Britain implies that this is about democracy, about human rights. But let's look at the record of the rebels that Britain is hoping to arm. Repeatedly over the last, not 2 years, but certainly over the last year or so, the rebels have been condemned again and again by human rights organisations, by the United Nations, for example. Even this week, the United Nations put out a major report in which both sides of the Syrian conflict were absolutely condemned for wholesale human rights abuses, execution and torture of prisoners of civilians, using child soldiers, kidnappings, and for example, endangering civilians by basing themselves in civilian areas. This is just the rebels. But, of course, in this consideration, we don't have to say, well, actually, they're both as bad as each other, because that seems to be the UN picture and everybody else's picture. We're only thinking about arming one of those sides. So it's only one side that we have to consider. Why would we be arming groups that are committing these horrific human rights abuses? And from what all the evidence on the ground actually shows, irrespective of what their leaders who don't actually live in Syria say, these rebels seem to have, in general, an agenda which is largely Islamist-driven and which has very little to do with human rights or to do with the rule of law or to do with secular democracy.
Well, but if you're right, it is inexplicable as to why the British government should be going down this road. Surely they must know something that you and I don't.
It is inexplicable, I think, unless you think of the bigger game of international politics. We need to look at who are already backing these rebels and who has something to gain and to lose from the situation that has been created and is being created. If we think of the British government and the French government's view, and indeed the US government, but to a lesser degree view, that the rebels will bring some kind of secular democracy to Syria, why on earth are their chief backers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar? These are extremist Sunni dictatorships, for want of a better word. In our media, they're called monarchies, for sure, but they are dictatorships, the same as Assad is a dictator in Syria. One is called a dictator, probably because he's not on the west side. Saudi Arabia, Qatar are called monarchies in our media, but they're dictatorships, and very repressive dictatorships indeed. You need to look at the general picture, the bigger picture of the Middle East, which is a conflict which has been going on for some time between different sects of Islam. One is Sunni, another is Shia. President Assad, for his sins, has been born a Shia. He runs a country which is predominantly Sunni. When you look at the rebellion is predominantly Sunni. In fact, it is almost entirely a Sunni rebellion. And many people are coming to realise that this conflict in Syria, this rebellion, is not about establishing democracy, it is not establishing human rights and so on, although everybody knows they need to be established in Syria. It is about replacing the Shia power, the Shia, S-H-I-A, Shia power that President Assad wields, notwithstanding that actually many senior officers in his government and in his army and indeed his wife are themselves Sunni, because it is largely a secular state in Syria. But when you look at who is backing these rebels, these two, the Saudis, Qatar and other Gulf countries, these are overwhelmingly Sunni states. And this is what the realpolitik, the mechanisms here are about. And when you look at when Britain insists that Syria should have democracy and human rights, quite rightly so, but it doesn't to the same degree make the same insistence to countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Sunni states, which the British government, I'm sure, would say, incidentally, are also extremely awash with oil and are extremely prevalent in placing very large arms and other orders with the United Kingdom. So there's a much bigger picture to it than what we see on our TV screens, I'm sure.
Well, Charles, let's bring a Syrian voice into the conversation. We're joined by Ribal Al-Assad from the Organisation for Democracy and Freedom in Syria. And I gather you're also a cousin of Bashar al-Assad.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening to you. Now,
evening,
Charles has been explaining why we shouldn't be agreeing with the French to arm the Syrian rebels. Now, you take a very different view.
Yes, actually, no. I think we shouldn't arm anyone. We shouldn't arm any sides, because I've been calling from the beginning that the only solution is a political solution. We cannot arm any sides today, because first of all, we have to know who the Free Syrian Army or who the Supreme Military Council, what is it made of. If we look at it, actually, we will see that it's made of Liwa al-Tawheed, which is a Salafist group, and it's all over the internet. It's made of Al-Farouk brigades. It's again another Salafi group. It's made of Shuhada Syria, which is the Martyrs of Syria, another Salafi groups. It's made of Sukur al-Sham, another Salafi group. These are the groups that make the Supreme Military Council. So when people talk about, yes, we have put Jabhat al-Nusra on the terrorist list, actually Jabhat al-Nusra is only one of the many groups. And we have to be very careful what is happening today, that there are a lot of foreign fighters, there are a lot of extremists coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from Chechnya, coming from, all over. They've been armed, as we have heard lately, there's a huge arm deal that went on from Croatia, that a lot of arms have been paid from Saudi Arabia. They have landed in Jordan, and they've been coming to the rebels. So I don't understand how come Britain or France, why should they take a side into arming one side or another? Actually, we have a dictatorship. We always have wanted democracy. Most of the Syrian people were looking for democracy. They were chanting and protesting in the beginning for genuine democracy, but they certainly did not remove. They certainly did not go out in the streets and risk their lives to change a dictatorship for theocracy. This is not what we want today in Syria. And we should not actually allow a country like Britain or France or the US should not allow countries, who are dictatorships themselves, autocratic regimes, to dictate our policies. This is completely insane.
It's interesting. We haven't really heard a lot from the United States on this over the last few days. I don't know what their attitude actually is. Well, Charles Ribal, we will come back to you in a few minutes' time. 0845 6060 973. Do you think that Britain and France should indeed be arming the Syrian rebels, or should we just keep well out of it? It's 7:16. This is LBC 97.3.
This is LB 97.3.
It's 7:20 here on LBC 97.3. We are talking about Syria because President Hollande, the French president, he's called for the EU arms embargo on Syria to be lifted in order to aid anti-government forces. David Cameron is in the Brussels summit at the moment. They're apparently going to raise this tomorrow and ask the EU to lift the arms embargo. Well, I wonder what the effects of that would be. 0845 6060 973. Do you think we should intervene in this conflict and allow the Syrian rebels to be armed? Well, in the studio with me is Charles Shoebridge. He's former army officer, security analyst and former counter-terrorism intelligence officer. And we're also joined by Ribal Al-Assad from the Organisation for Democracy and Freedom in Syria. Before we go to the calls, Ribal, let's talk to you for a little bit longer. How much control does President Assad have? Because a lot of people are saying, well, it's actually the army that's in control of the country. He's a bit of a puppet.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. He is a bit of a puppet, and the army is in control. The security services are in control. And, of course, as you know, there's the Ba'ath Party who has managed until now to stay, to galvanize their support towards the regime. And this was one of the biggest mistake that the media have done in the West is that they were from the beginning attacking the Baathists, they were attacking the minorities, Alawites, they were attacking the Assad family as a whole, instead of just concentrating on the regime or the clique that's around, Bashar. Instead, this is where we found ourselves, is that all the minorities who were worried, as you know, Syria is made up of 45% of minorities, Christians, Druze, Alawites, Shias, Kurds, are all very worried about what might come next, and they don't see a viable alternative. They certainly don't see it in the Syrian National Coalition, which was not formed democratically. It was just first the SNC was brought in Qatar, and they were put in a room, and they said these are the representatives of the Syrian people, and then they were taken after a year and a half. When they failed, they were taken to Qatar, and they said now it's called the coalition. And these are the representatives of the Syrian people. There were no elections. How could we know that these are the people that are representative of the Syrian people? Why did they leave out many other opposition groups such as ourselves or the National Coordination Committees and many others who were not invited? Were not only not invited, were not even allowed to go to these conferences, Friends of Syria conferences and others.
Now, Bashar al-Assad, as I said before, is your cousin. Presumably you've had a bit of a falling out somewhere along the way. Tell us a bit about him. Similar age? He's obviously a bit older than you, but
he's 10 years old. He's 10 years older than I am. I left Syria, as you know. I was 9 years of age. I was in 1984 when my father fell out with his brother because my father was calling at that time during the 70s and 80s for democracy and freedom in Syria and the Middle East. He had the only magazine in the Middle East at the time, which he started in 1967, and the name was Al-Fursan, which meant the Nights, calling in every edition that why it's very important to have democracy in Syria and the Middle East, and mainly in a country like Syria where you have a lot of minorities and it's made up of such a beautiful mosaic of people. But we should see that as a strength, and as a strength, not as a weakness. And unfortunately, today, he left Syria. He preferred to leave than to get into, any arms, conflict with his brother. He left Syria. He continued everything he had done. I mean, his magazine was closed down. The Association for the Highly Educated People, which had 30,000 members at the time, and Patrick Seale spoke of in his book, that it was competing with the Ba'ath Party, was also closed down. He had introduced the women into the military, and there were, thousands and thousands of women paratroopers in Syria. Again, all this program was stopped. He really tried to do a lot of things. Everything he tried to do was stopped as when he left Syria. He continued his fight for democracy. We started the first Arab news channel in the Middle East to promote democracy and freedom. It was in 1997 from London. It was a satellite TV channel. 2 years later, as you know, they bombed our house in Latakia. I went there in 1999. I came to visit my family and my father in Spain, and the army attacked and bombed our house. And unfortunately, at the time, we were going around telling people that they attacked our house. We were calling the media. We were calling everyone. Nobody wanted to hear about it. We were like, people are dying there, but something needs to be done about it. But everyone took the side and the version of the regime that they attacked an illegal port belonging to Ribal Al-Assad. And unfortunately, a year later, when my uncle passed away, Bashar was brought, as you know, in a very, illegitimate way. And unfortunately, again, we were the only voice out of all this opposition that you could see today that came out and said, this is illegitimate. Where are we going? You're giving, this is Syria. This is not some island. The guy is 34 years old. Syria has very important geostrategic place in the Middle East. Bashar doesn't have any, he doesn't have any experience. He doesn't, neither in the military or the Ba'ath Party, or he didn't even grew in the ranks of the military. So it was very, very dangerous. And again, you had countries, Britain, France, the US, everyone went there. Madeleine Albright, Tony Blair, Jacques Chirac, King Abdullah of Saudi, they all went there and congratulated Bashar.
He was seen as a bit of a Westerner. He was educated in this country, has a British wife.
Of course, he stayed. When you live a year in a country, that doesn't make you British educated. That's first where you have to.
Was he only here for a year?
Yes.
I thought didn't he work in a hospital as well?
That again, it's the propaganda that they made. Actually, the image that he has today, it was made by the West. It wasn't made by anyone else. Bashar studied abroad. Bashar, the British educated. Bashar, the Westerner. This doesn't make someone British educated. You know very well that there are a lot of people who have been living here for 10 years and 30 years.
I stand corrected. Right, let's take a couple of calls. Steve is in Camden. Hello, Steve.
Hi, good evening. I think there's no question about it. I think the rebels, as you say, I think there's a massive advantage in arming them, not because it's going to create a different country or a better reality, but because I think in defeating the government, what will happen is it'll bring to an end a terrible tragedy with so many people dying. But I think we should be under no misapprehension that after the rebels take over, which there's no question about it, they will. The country is not going to the Arabs. Every Arab Spring, if you look at the reality, really, I can't see how the situation has created a greater democracy within all the countries that have where the governments have been toppled in the last 2 years. And I think that Syria will be exactly the same situation.
Steve, I'm not following your logic here, because you're saying on the one hand we should arm the rebels and overthrow the government, but we don't really know what will follow, and that doesn't matter. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we should arm the rebels because clearly we need to put the rebels into power. Only but only to end the tragedy of the thousands of people that have been killed and the hundreds that are dying daily out there. Because if we don't intervene, the situation will just will continue.
Right, let's get a comment from Charles Shoebridge.
Yeah, I hear what you say, and of course everybody wants to end this tragedy, not least, of course, the people in Syria as to what's going on. But of course the logic of arming one side so that we can get it over with would equally apply, of course, to forgetting about the rebels and sending all the arms we've got to help Assad, which, of course, is exactly what we've done in other countries, like, for example, Mali, where exactly or very similar type situation was happening, except there in Mali we were on the side of those fighting against Islamist rebels, whereas, of course, in Syria we're actually on the side promoting Islamist rebels. The other question that I'd put is this for thinking about, is that, yes, we don't like, and nor do a lot of people like, Assad's government. It's a dictatorship, it has secret police, torture, murder, and so on. But let's just think about this for a minute. Supposing what replaces him is very, very much worse. And the reason why I say it may well be worse is because, at least with the Assad government, you have a government which is by and large not sectarian. We've heard already tonight about the great mix, the mosaic as it was called, about Syria's ethnic and cultural makeup. When you get one side being turned on the other, which is what's happening in this rebellion, where Sunnis, not Sunni people, but certainly Sunni rebels and extremist rebels, are carrying out sectarian attacks, a lot of people are being killed and are being driven from their homes in a form of ethnic cleansing, then if you put that on a national scale, as may well happen, you will get a catastrophe that makes the current situation really look like a playground, and clearly it isn't.
Ribal, a quick word from you.
Yes, also, I think that's also insane what's being said about arming the rebels, because I think it's been 2 years, and I hope that people could watch from YouTube and from the TVs what's been going on in Syria, and if they could see that there's enough arms in Syria, because obviously the country has been completely destroyed. Aleppo has been destroyed. Deir ez-Zor has been destroyed. A lot of quarters in Damascus, Homs has been completely destroyed. So obviously this has been done by both sides. There has been nearly 90,000 dead until now. And again, this has been done by both sides. We could see videos on the internet of people, how they are committing sectarian fights. And let's not forget also that today it has become, this whole issue has become a regional issue. It has become a sectarian issue in the whole region. We have the regime in Syria is not like Libya. The regime in Syria is supported by Iran, by Iraq, as we have seen lately, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, saying we have to be very careful about those people taking over the regime, because we will have the same thing, a sectarian war going in Iraq. We have seen also tensions between the Free Syrian Army and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is going to drag the whole region into regional war, and this would have been again, warning.
We'll expand on that in just a second. Ribal, Charles, stay with us. You're listening to LBC 97.3 at 7:31. And here with the very latest news headlines, it's Dan Whitehead.
Westminster Council has pulled all mail and drive.
25 to 8 here on LBC 97.3. We're talking about Syria and asking you whether you think that France and Britain should arm the rebels in Syria, even if they don't have support from other EU countries. Well, French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, he said today that that's exactly what should happen. President Hollande, he's in Brussels at the EU summit. He wants to arm the Syrian rebels, and I think David Cameron and William Hague do too, although they haven't actually quite said so. What do you think Britain's attitude should be to this? 0845 6060 973. With me in the studio, and they're going to be taking your calls in just a second, are Charles Shoebridge, former Army officer, security analyst, and former counter-terrorism intelligence officer, and Ribal Al-Assad is from the Organisation for Democracy and Freedom in Syria. He's also a cousin of Bashar al-Assad. Just before we go to your calls, Ribal, do you sort of spend time dreaming about going back to your homeland? Do you think you'll ever end up living there again?
I mean, of course, everyone wants to have the possibility to go back to his country. I've been exiled since I was 9 years old, and I've dreamt of being able to go back. I have a baby son now who, is British, but I would also love him to go back and see his, country and be able to know his cousins and his, I have brothers and nephews who are still there that I haven't met until now. I mean, I have nephews who I haven't met.
Yeah. Right, well, let's go to your calls. Taz is in Pimlico. Hello, Taz.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, what would you like to say?
Quite simply, the way I feel about this whole thing, and I'm not sure about the rest of the UK, we should take the moral high ground on this. in the 70s and 80s, we were seen to help other dictatorships or things that were considered to be wrong according to our Western principles. Dare I said, you got the Zimbabwean issue. Now we've ended up with a dictator. You've got other countries that went along the same lines. And to be honest, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. How it changes after they've achieved their goals it doesn't necessarily mean it'll tie in with Western ideals.
When you say we need to take the moral high ground, I mean, there are different definitions of that, aren't there? You could argue that there's a humanitarian situation developing that one side needs to triumph over the other for it to be resolved, and therefore it would be quite a moral thing to do to arm the rebels.
Yes and no. We did the same thing when we went into Iraq, and look what's happened. There was no exit strategy, and now the whole place is, well, it's a melting pot. And you could probably make the same mistake and go into Syria. To be honest, I think the people in the Middle East need to sort out their own problems rather than us interfering. They know how to interact with each other. We don't. They have cultural things that the West probably doesn't even begin to understand how to deal with.
Ribal, that's quite an interesting point from Taz there. Do you think there's... a lot of people accuse Britain and America and France of, when they involve themselves in these sorts of disputes, of having sort of some post-colonial imperialist sort of reason for doing it. I mean, there isn't actually any reason for Britain to get involved, is there? Because, I mean, we don't have any particular strategic interest in Syria.
Yes, Ian, but, you know, the problem, the mentality in the Middle East that's the way that people, they still remember how, how under the Ottoman Empire and then the French colonies and the British colonies, all of that. But also today, we have to understand something, is that today, a lot of houses have satellite TV stations. Today, you cannot lie to people anymore. You cannot be hypocritical when you deal with people. A lot of people have access to internet. Everybody has a mobile phone. So you cannot, for example, promote democracy and freedom, which are values that we all share here in the West, and then, go to, and be selective about it. I mean, you cannot say we want democracy and freedom in Syria and Qatar. We're okay with Qatar, for example, where a poet was jailed a couple of months ago, life in jail just because he criticized the emir and his son. This is nuts. Again, just a very short while ago, Mohammed Al-Qahtani, who's a human rights activist in Saudi Arabia and professor in Riyadh, he was again arrested, and he was saying that the Saudis are sending Salafi fighters to Syria just to ease the tensions, from Saudi. Well, this is not right. This is why the British government and Europe should always take, as the person who just spoke said, the moral ground. We should be standing by our values, the values that we really believe in.
Well, let's get a different perspective on this from Malik Al-Abde, joins me on the line. He's a Syrian journalist based in London. Malik, good evening, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Now, do you think we should be arming the rebels?
I think Britain should be arming the rebels because that's really the only sort of effective way to end this conflict reasonably quickly.
Even though we don't really know who they are?
Well, I think the British government know who these rebels are. Maybe they're not known to the British public or your listeners, but Britain does have an intelligence organization, and they are active in the Turkish-Syrian border, so they have a pretty good idea who these people are. They're also involved in training certain elements of the Free Syrian Army in Jordan as well. So they know who these people are, and obviously they have a certain level of trust in these people to be willing to arm them.
There's a problem with that, though, isn't there? And that is that, for example, this week the head of the Joint Services of U.S. Intelligence presented a report to Congress, which, of course, has been put together in, if you like, liaison with British and other intelligence services around the world. And that concludes that not only has the Arab Spring in general caused instabilities, caused chaos, caused sectarian conflict, and the rise of extremism and a problematic effect for U.S. relations with those countries, but that in specifically speaking about Syria, that Al-Qaeda-linked groups, certainly very Islamist and extremist groups, are not just taking part in this rebellion, but are actually dominating it. They are the main part of this rebellion. And of course, ironically, and it is ironic in a way, one of the main reasons why the British government, like talking about Haig and Cameron, have said that we should be arming these rebels, is actually we should be arming rebels who are moderate rebels, and I say that in inverted commas, to combat these extremist rebels.
Malik.
Well, I mean, look, we could either, I mean, the UK, France, and the US could either turn their back on the huge social movement that's happening in the Arab world as a whole, known as the Arab Spring. Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, of course, and Yemen. There is a huge movement for change in these countries. Now, the West could either turn its back on these movements and say we want nothing to do with it, and we'd rather stick with the old dictators, or they could actually try to influence the new governments that will emerge in these countries and try to temper their action. Now, so far that's worked reasonably well in Libya, and also, of course, the Prime Minister visited Egypt to have influence over the Muslim Brotherhood president there. So the West, I think, has to engage with these Arab Spring revolutions rather than simply to say, well, this is only going to lead to Al-Qaeda taking over, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you just turn your back and say, well, they're all extremists, we want nothing to do with them, well, eventually the extremists will they will take over.
Malik, I'm just going to bring Ribal Al-Assad into the conversation. We'll come back to you in a second.
Yes, Ian. Sorry, I disagree here with Malik Al-Abdi, and this is actually one more reason why we shouldn't arm the rebels in Syria, is that first of all, we have seen exactly what went on in Egypt and what went on in Tunisia and what went on in Libya, and how those countries are suffering today from those Islamists that took over. We have seen all the demonstrations that are going down, all the people that have been deceived by what they thought was going to be an Arab Spring where they were going to get genuine democracies, and instead we got Morsi in Egypt, where everybody's calling the new pharaoh. And also, I would like to quote the American Secretary of Justice, who is currently visiting the region, and who says that the majority of the element of the Free Syrian Army are following the Al-Qaeda ideology. So, I think the Justice Secretary of the United States knows very well what he's talking about, and we could see a lot of people today in the media and in many governments who know very well who are the elements of the Free Syrian Army and of the Supreme Council.
Malik, a quick response from you?
Well, I mean, very quickly, look, I mean, the revolution in Syria started peacefully, we all know this. It went on for about a year, largely a peaceful revolution, and it was the violent turn happened because Bashar al-Assad, your guest's cousin, actually, Bashar al-Assad doesn't want to give his people any sort of democratic rights. He refuses the principle of there being free and fair elections in the country, and that's why we have reached this position. Actually, Bashar al-Assad bears primary responsibility for the civil war that's unfolding in the country, and he definitely has to go. Now, I believe that ultimately there will have to be negotiations, not between necessarily the opposition and Bashar al-Assad, the president, but between the different social forces that make up Syria. And you will need to agree on a new constitution and a new way to coexist with each other. But I simply don't see how Bashar al-Assad can be part of future Syria. I just don't see it.
Okay, Malik, thank you very much indeed. That's Malik Al-Abdi, Syrian journalist based in London. We'll come straight to your calls just as soon as we can after the travel. 0845 6060 I'll say that again. 0845 6060 973. Put my teeth back in. It's 7:46. And in the LBC 97.3 Travel Centre, here's Adam Moore.
Thanks very much, Ian. First to the roads, Fulham Broadway 97.3.
And it's 11 minutes to 8 here on LBC 97.3. We're talking about Syria. Charles Shoebridge and Ribal Al-Assad are still with me. We're going to go straight to your calls. 0845 6060 973. Should we be arming the Syrian rebels? It seems that that's what the French President and the British Prime Minister intend to do. Riz is in Hounslow. Hello, Riz.
Hi, Ian. Okay, interesting debate. The thing is, we already are arming the Syrian rebels. It's not like they're a few weapons short. The only difference is we're doing it through our proxies, the Saudis and the Qatari royal family. And so it's not like we're not arming, it's not like direct arming.
How can you say that they're our proxies?
Well, the thing is, it's true. The Syrian uprising is actually it's a coup that we're creating. I mean, one of the comments I made, there's 90,000 dead. They're not 90,000 dead just purely because of the Syrian government. There's 90,000 dead because the FSA has been killing the Syrian people. And not only that, if you look at how this actually all started, the FSA, or the sort of troublemakers, already started attacking the Syrian army while they was going through the peaceful demonstration. And if you go back in the history of this, you will find out that it's our proxy through the Qatar royal family and the Saudi royal family that we have been creating trouble.
Let's bring in Charles Shoebridge on this, because I think it's important that we get to the bottom of this.
I think you make some very good points there, although arguably, of course, and I'm sure it won't necessarily go against your line of argument, many people would argue that in a Syrian-type situation, in fact, it is Britain and France who are Saudi Arabia and Qatar's proxies, because we are the people who are then doing their bidding to fight their war by providing arms and so on for their chosen side, for their own particular purposes in this situation.
What are their purposes?
Their purposes are to promote their own brand of Sunni extreme Islam, and they also, of course, want to emasculate, to weaken, and if possible, even partition a country like Syria, because it is an ally of Iran, and of course, it's in that context that it dovetails with the foreign policies of Israel, France, and Britain and the US. And that is probably the real reason why we are backing these people, because it will destroy Syria. It's not about democracy, it is about the bigger game of actually isolating and getting Iran. Let me just give you the figures, actually, because I have these figures. In terms of casualties, the UN's latest figures are around 70,000 dead. And it's an interesting point you make, because very often when you hear, for example, British politicians speaking, they blame it all as if the army has carried out all these killings. The figures are something like 15,000 soldiers and security forces have died. Something like 10,000 rebels have died, and about 45,000 civilians have died, split between both sides.
Riz, very quick response from you.
Yeah, no, I find that interesting, but I think he's got how he's thinking about it slightly wrong, because the thing is, ultimately, the vested interest is Iran. I do know that. And all the Syrians that are, like, I've got very good Syrian friends, and I speak to them on the phone, not on a daily basis, but I was before it all started up, and a little bit afterwards as well, because they're obviously afraid of people obviously tapping into the cause. And in the beginning, a lot of the Syrians that I speak to thought, that we were the Free Syrian Armies, until they started realizing that these are the people that are coming through Jordan and Turkey, supported by the Qataris and the Saudis, that these are not what Syrians' interests at heart. And the more this prolongs, what's happening is we're actually, the British and the French are actually losing the battle. So that's the reason why they need to arm the the FSA, because they're not winning. And eventually, if it drags out any longer, one of your commentators from the newspaper, he made the comment, oh no, that there is no future with Assad. There's no future with Assad once we start arming them or start facilitating them to military needs.
Okay, Riz.
And I'm sorry, and can I just make one point?
Very quickly.
Any Syrian that's living abroad that allows NATO or UK or France to attack using depleted uranium in Syria is a traitor to their nation. And this is the same thing as the Libyans have done. All the people that are in Libya right now that allowed NATO to bomb it, they are traitors, because we use depleted uranium, we use weapons of mass destruction without fail.
Right, Riz, you've had a good run for your money. Thank you very much indeed. Charles, very quickly, you wanted to respond there?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's arguable that the only beneficiaries of certainly British and American and French foreign policy in Syria at the moment will be Israel and Saudi Arabia as Iran's enemies. Certainly what we're doing, arming rebels, pouring weapons in, isn't going to do any good for British long-term interests, or, of course, for the Saudis who are the Syrians who are on the receiving end of these weapons.
Daniel on Twitter has a question for you, Ribal. It says, ask him if he fears being assassinated by pro-Bashir forces. That's my big worry for him.
Well, to be very honest, we have always feared, until now, we have always feared of both the regime and the Islamists attempt to do an assassination attempt. Actually, just now, before I came to your show, our neighbors' security have just told us that it has been 2 days that there have been 2 cars going around our house, and they have stopped the driver of our neighbor's driver, and they followed him to Knightsbridge. They've stopped him, and they've told him, we'll give you £10,000 if you give us information on when Ribal Al-Assad is in town and where he goes to. So, of course, we are very worried about our security things. We have always been. We have had a few attempts from the regime and from the Islamists in the past. And, but we have to fight for democracy. This is what we have to do. And we're certainly not going to give it up, neither for dictatorship or for the Islamists.
Let's go to Pierre in Westminster. Pierre, hi.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to make one point. One of the previous callers made a point which I thought was completely wrong around Libya and hailing Libya as actually an example of something that worked well. It's actually the opposite, and I can't believe that our memories are so short that we already forgot what happened in the aftermath of the Libyan intervention in terms of all the weaponry provided to the rebels, and to an extent the weaponry that was already in Libya, moving across porous borders to other areas and igniting other fire points in the region. And that's what's going to happen if we add more weapons to what's already an extremely volatile region with a number of ethnic groups that might want to pursue their separate agendas once let's say the dictator is toppled. And that's really my worry there.
Well, Charles Shoebridge, we look back at Libya. David Cameron, President Sarkozy, viewed as a triumph at the time. We don't actually hear much about Libya now. What's happened since Gaddafi was toppled?
If you're active online, you will hear, which I know you are anyway, but what people will hear a lot about Libya, it'll be from people like Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, from the UN, from lawyers groups, from human rights activists, all complaining at what the situation there is. It's also from intelligence assessments, as your previous caller indicated. So, for example, a lot of people don't know here that US drones are already routinely flying over Libya. The terrorist threat there has become so great. The threat to Western interests from, in many cases, the people that the West has put in power or given power there in all these hundreds of armed militias that now run the country, that it can't be long before the West is then arguing that because of the West's intervention there in bringing the Islamist rebels to power, that we then have to intervene again to sort them out. And that's probably what down the line is going to happen in Syria, where the assessments are saying that we are creating these ungoverned spaces, we're creating anarchy, and in those places, just as happened in Mali, is where the threat to the West from terrorism comes.
You see, I always like to finish the programme on an uplifting note, and you've thoroughly depressed me there. I mean, Ribal, do you get depressed by the thought of that could happen also to Syria?
Yes, actually, in the beginning we were very optimistic when we saw those people, those young Arabs going, asking for their rights and chanting for their rights. But then when, it got hijacked by the Islamists, you have interest, as you know, Saudi Arabia and Qatar started competing even between each other. The Qataris arming the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, the Saudis arming the Salafist jihadists, Wahhabis. So we started, there's an arms race between them as who's going to control what after the Arab Spring. And we have seen, the results in Egypt, we have seen the results in Libya, we have seen the results in Tunisia. Unfortunately, this is where the West has not intervened and has not supported, the real, democratic forces who are on the ground.
Ernie says we should keep out of Syria and we should not arm the rebels. Have we learned nothing? Someone else says England always has to have a say in other countries' wars. Why? We'll leave that question hanging. Charles Ribal, thank you very much indeed for joining.